and the increasing cost of social care means I am likely to be taken behind a barn and shot the first time I break a hip anyway. Cheers, Tony. So this video is going to be a little bit different to the usual. This is less of an educational video and more of a personal reflection really, on the way that the future was presented to me in my formative years, and then the, let's be real, disappointing reality. As a young person, you are told that if you follow a series of steps and behaviours that are presented to you by your family, school and the state, you will be rewarded with a life that fulfills certain criteria. In the US, you have the American dream, and in the UK you have every Englishman's home is his castle. They both encapsulate some idea of financial freedom, security and contentment that stands as a societal goal for doing what you're supposed to do. If you do X for society, society will do Y for you. This video is about promises made and not kept, and what that means for the millennial generation in the UK, and indeed beyond. Whilst I was born in the 80s, the 90s was what largely shaped me as a person, particularly the later 90s. The Millennium, Y2K, the big J-Lad's 2000th birthday. The UK was just coming to realise that all the optimism that had swept Tony Blair into office had started to dissipate. And many were wondering what had happened to the sunlit uplands promised by the hysterically uncool Cool Britannia movement of the mid-90s. Instead of this self-congratulatory cultural masturbation living into the next century, its nominated champions, Oasis, the Spice Girls, Blair and Austin Powers, had all aged like bread. And rather than surfing a revolution of the arts into the unknown of the new millennium, the UK instead looked a bit confused at the reflection it saw when it looked in the mirror. For a short while there, the UK seemed to have a head of momentum heading into the late 90s, but somehow it didn't seem like it was a place that was ready for the future TM. There was something akin to a period of national self-reflection as we approached the Millennium Eve, and aside from worrying about the Millennium bug, kids can look that one up, people were beginning to wonder when the promised dawn of the new Britain was to arrive for ordinary people. We had some shiny new pop stars, a new TV channel, the Eurostar, a booming banking sector, and yet the UK still felt like it was living in the past to a large extent, looking longingly back at the heyday of the empire. There was just a feeling that we didn't really know what our country was going to be or do in the 21st century. We were experiencing the dissonance of a future filled with all the possibility inherent in a new millennium, overlaid with the doubts, fears and shame of an imperial power on the wane. My experience of the run-up to the millennium and the years that followed after shaped much of who I am today, and I think, as I approach my 40th birthday, I want to talk about what we believed was the promise of 21st century Britain, and the battered, subjugated mess that is the reality. As 20th century poet William Smith once boasted in his song Will 2K, it's time for us to enter
the new millennium, Millennium.
First off, there are two definitions I want to cover so that we are all on the same page. Firstly, let's talk about the term millennial, as this is one that still seems to be used interchangeably with teenager by many interwebs. So let's clarify by heading over to Wikipedia. The Merriam-Webster dictionary defines millennial as a person born in the 1980s or 1990s. Jonathan Roche, senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, wrote for The Economist in 2018 that generations are squishy concepts, but the 1981 to 1996 birth cohort is widely accepted definition for millennial. So let's get one thing out there nice and early. The youngest millennial is either 24 or 27 and is, in either instance, is well into grown-up territory. So let's drop the lazy kids branding that is wielded by bald white men with sunglasses on their Facebook profile pictures. We get it. The eyes age first, but you're not fooling anybody. At the older end of the millennial bracket, you have people now into their 40s. So let us put aside childish things, except for nostalgia tap, because we millennials are quite fond of that. But this video isn't going to be some long whinge about us poor millennials as such, or how much we've been screwed by the property markets, etc. It's more specifically about how we were lied to about what we get in return for doing a good social reproduction. See vid linked here for more on that specific concept. And what all this means for the generations after us. What we are talking about is a form of social contract. So let's discuss that concept really quickly. Now, social contract theory is a big old subject on its own, and I'm not looking to get too far into the weeds here. So let's just consider the very basic principle as explained on Wikipedia. Social contract arguments typically are that individuals have consented, either explicitly or tacitly, to surrender some of their freedoms and submit to the authority of the ruler or to the decision of a majority in exchange for protection of their remaining rights or maintenance of the social order. To make it even more plain, we, as people in society, all agree to play ball with the rules of the majority in exchange for promises of safety, peace, and some level of comfort. So we don't commit crimes, we contribute our labour in some form or another, and in return, we get to live a decent life. Simple, right? So what was it that was presented to my generation, those set to come of age in the early years of the new millennium, as the social contract we were expected to honour? Well, before I get into my personal experience, let's see what the government of the time said. And that means it's Blair. Let's start with Blair's first conference speech after becoming Prime Minister, where he outlined his plans for the Labour government. He said,
"Today I want to set an ambitious course for this country, to be nothing less than the model 21st century nation, a beacon to the world. It means drawing deep into the richness of the British character, creative, compassionate, outward-looking, old British values, but a new British confidence. We can never be the biggest. We may never again be the mightiest, but we can be the best. The best place to live, the best place to bring up children, to lead a fulfilled life, the best place to grow old."
bold words. And despite the duplicitous and bloodthirsty nature of the man in question, there is no denying that he could rhetoric with the best of them and get people on side. He projected a vision of 21st century life as high value, progressive, and as an example that the world would want to follow. He continues,
So today I say to the British people, the chains of mediocrity have been broken. The tired days are behind us. We are free to excel once more. We are free to build that model 21st century nation, to become that beacon to the world. Creative, compassionate, confident of our place in that world.
Finally, of specific interest to my generation is this.
Only 30% of youngsters in Britain can be admitted to university. Fewer, not just in the USA or France, fewer than South Korea. There's a hard choice. Stay as we are and decline, or modernise and win. The first £165 million is already in next year's budget, and we will lift the cap on student numbers and set a target for an extra 500,000 people into higher and further education by the year 2002. We should construct an education system that is a beacon to the world.
The repetitious parts of this speech, the creative, compassionate, and the beacon, signal a vision of a kinder, more free version of the UK, focusing on being the best at niche fields as opposed to trying to compete on every metric against far bigger and far more powerful countries. This last piece of messaging on the higher education part certainly filtered down to the parents of millennials, and it became accepted very quickly as a new roadmap for working class success, theoretically available for everyone. School, uni, successful job, happy life. It was treated as a near certainty that having a degree meant a good job and a comfortable life. Even more so if you could get your head around these newfangled computers and this thing I kept hearing about called the internet. I am very old after all. I mean, 40 is like 90 in YouTube years. Ancient. Going back to the late 90s and early 2000s, there was a lot of language in support of entrepreneurialism at the time, with smiling walnut Richard Branson presented as the face of modern British business, and the Thatcherite work ethic of self-enrichment at any cost being presented as the correct way for workers to think. We had Dragon's Den, The Apprentice, and the like sprang up a little bit later, but the seeds of that mentality was definitely sown at the turn of the millennium. As the Demon himself stated in a Guardian article in 2005, New Labour is today the party of aspiration for middle class and poorer families, for all. The relative upswing in the economic conditions of the UK around the middle and end of the 90s has long been fought over by the Tories and Labour, who were both keen to claim stewardship of this economic shift. Regardless of whether any party was actually responsible, there was a feeling that jobs were available for those that needed them, or at least that was my perception at the time. As someone who headed off to university in 2001, this made for a fairly optimistic premise for me personally, where I continued to operate under the belief that if I could get a degree, I'd be able to walk out of uni straight into a decent paying job, and then I was set for life. That's what everyone was saying. Oh, you sweet summer child. So I packed my bags, moved out of home, and began the next chapter of my life. What could go wrong? An incredible amount went wrong almost immediately. When I left uni, the year was 2004. It was safe to say that by that time, things had started to deteriorate. I had a degree, and yet there weren't really many jobs that wanted a graduate, as it turns out. Having a large influx of degree-educated young people entering the job market at the same time just kind of lowered wages and made finding a job a bit trickier than anticipated. The job I ended up getting was certainly not well paid. I, like many in my generation, had become disenfranchised with the government and wider democracy after being so clearly ignored over the Iraq War and then given so few options electorally. Many parts of the country that had been promised investment had seemingly been forgotten about, and the young were feeling increasingly victimised by Labour's mixture of uninterested indifference and cold persecution via ASBO's mosquito noise emitters and the war on drugs. Incidentally, it was always quite telling that the drugs being warred against were mostly the ones that poorer people used, and not the ones allegedly being hoovered up around Westminster. Curious. Electorally, UKIP had just taken 12 seats in the European elections, Labour had lost 400 seats in the most recent local election, and the very next year, Blair would win a third term, but with the smallest vote share of any winning party in UK history. Labour had made a right dog's dinner of things, and the country was turning against them slowly, and only the laughable inadequacy of the Tory leaders at this stage was keeping Labour in power. The economy was still growing, but people had started to notice that things like increases in GDP and economic growth didn't tend to materialise into tangible improvements for ordinary people. And people questioned what happened to the party that promised. The chains of mediocrity have broken. The tired days are behind us, we are free to excel once more. This didn't feel like excellence. I sit here now talking to you as someone turning 40 in a few months, someone that has nominally followed the path that I was told was the correct one. Social reproduction went as it was supposed to. I learned what was expected of me, the way that things worked, what I had to do to have a semi-decent lifestyle, and yada yada yada. I did well at school, I did well at uni, and I've been working full-time ever since then. I've been a law-abiding citizen, you can't prove anything. I have paid my taxes, I continue to pay off my debts, and I try to ensure that I don't make anyone else's life harder with my presence. I may not have pulled up any trees in the course of my career, but my expectations are fairly modest. They're simply what was presented to me as a child, adolescent, and young adult. I just wanted a house, a relatively secure job, and public services that are fit for the 21st century in what remains a top 10 economy. So, let's see where I am. I part own a small flat. And I say own, but let's be real, I still have another 25 years before I own that. I have a decent job, but it's far from guaranteed from one year to the next, and in fact the number of industries that can now be considered secure are down to the fingers on one hand. The age of retirement creeps back a year about every 10 years, so I fully expect to be dead before I ever get to enjoy my twilight years. But that probably works out, since the world will likely be some combination of drowning and burning long before that. And the increasing cost of social care means I am likely to be taken behind a barn and shot the first time I break a hip anyway. Public service-wise, well, there is universal credit, so called because it treats everyone as thieving scum and with the same level of contempt, all without giving people enough to live with any sense of comfort or security. Dealing with universal credit is kind of like dealing with a mixture of Mr. Bean and the player character from Papers, Please. They constantly misunderstand the info you give them, often becoming confused and going quiet for a few months before someone new takes over and you start the whole fun process all over again. Then there is public transport, which is a mixture of absent and expensive or overcrowded and expensive, depending upon how your postcode lottery placed you within the country. Speaking of postcode lottery, the NHS is rather poignantly beginning to resemble the sort of person that you might find in A&E. Bloodied, bruised, and ready to collapse, with expensive but inefficient privately sourced bandages being used to temporarily cover the worst injuries. Incidentally, NHS dentist places are now rarer than a GP's appointment, meaning people will likely soon be paying for private healthcare in both circumstances, which is a nice legacy for Labour to have introduced. Cheers, Tony. Our energy suppliers are currently in the middle of the most blatant price gouging exercise ever seen, and all despite the fact that the means to produce virtually free energy already exists. The current government believes in the efficiency of the free market and refuses to interfere or attempt to recoup any of the profits, but don't worry, Starmer says he will do, let me just check my notes, a nationally owned energy company, wait for it, that is a private-public partnership. So clearly he has learnt bugger all from the last 30 years of failed private-public partnerships. Our military is simultaneously culturally worshipped as heroic avatars of patriotic goodness, and yet starved of basic funding both during and especially after service, with most of its money seemingly being spent on vibrating death machines and ships that can't survive contact with seawater. So economically, we are in the toilet, with little sign of a way out. Our public services are a broken and privatised shambles, and our political options are so similar, I have heard they're going to try to save money on the next general election by printing the same manifesto 3 times but in different colours. I sure hope you aren't counting on retirement, because apart from the constantly slipping retirement age, the state pension is already famously bad, private pensions are seemingly always teetering on the brink, and the coming shock of private elder care costs could see us all working into our 80s. Oh, and the world is burning, drowning, shaking, and running out of nutrient-rich soil. But don't worry too much about that, say the politicians and billionaires responsible for allowing it to get into this state. This country has seemingly been on a downward spiral in one form or another since the turn of the century. Handily accelerated, of course, by the Tories' austerity project, ably assisted by the Lib Dems, once again proving that, like Liz Truss, they can always make a bad situation worse. The complete capitulation of any hope for anything better than what we've been given has been near total, with journalists and TV pundits seal-clapping along as we watch cheaply thrown together identikit homes selling for hundreds of thousands of pounds to landlords and investors. Is there even one thing we can point to in this country that has gotten better since the turn of the century? Oh yeah, there is one thing.
Let's zoom in, everybody, for the big moment. We're going to find out, is Thatcher dead? Let's find out. Honk if Thatcher's dead. Let's find out. That's a yes.
Things have gotten considerably worse in this country over my lifetime, and it's very hard to point at much in terms of the state, the economy, or the mood of the country that hasn't declined in a significant way. David of Podcasting is Praxis once joked in an episode that the unofficial British mantra is everything must stay the same or get worse. And regardless as to whether anyone agrees with that as a mindset, it certainly appears to be the reality. We were raised to believe that getting educated, going to uni and working hard would get you a home of your own in a cutting-edge beacon country of the 21st century. Instead, we got, well, this. Our social contract was not fulfilled. So who is responsible? What happens when society fails its citizens? We did what we were supposed to do. We are the most educated generation in this country's history. We grew up under New Labour and then Tory austerity, and have seen every possible public service decimated by the stupidity of allowing for-profit companies to run things that people need. How's those energy prices again? It felt like millennials took a long time to become politically aware, but most I speak to now are a lot more invested in politics than their parents were. Most are much more switched on to the biases of the media than their parents were, and most are much more liberally minded than their parents ever were too. The next generation look to be even more radicalised than us, born as they were into the austerity of the post-2008 mess, having seen incompetent capitalist government after government making feeble arguments as to why misery should be allowed to continue. Us millennials should pave the way for them, should provide our support and guidance where requested, and remember the lies that we were told as young people by those building a world that was never going to be for us. Our traumas, failures and disappointments need not be theirs, and their social contract will likely be a lot less tenable than ours was, and likely just as false. Karl Marx once remarked, "The English have all the material requisites for the revolution. What they lack is the spirit of generalization and revolutionary ardour. Maybe, just maybe, with our help, the generation after us might change that." Thanks for sitting through this cathartic mess of thoughts, memories, feelings, and musings. There aren't many facts in there. There's a lot of subjective perspective. But I hope maybe it had some value for some of you. The late 90s and early 2000s were a very odd time to be growing up. And being young at that time makes it even trickier, since perceptiveness was not one of my strengths back then. But it is important to think over our experiences and see how they fit in with what we can later see were larger movements. Anyway, please give the video a like if you enjoyed it, subscribe for more content, and make sure you talk with your younger comrades. Bye for now.